Hello. For today, I'm going to be discussing making a smock pattern. But before I get started, please make sure to like my video and click the subscribe button down at the bottom to help keep you up to date when future videos come out. So, welcome to how to make a medieval smock. Did you know that Viking smocks seem to be similar to how 16th century smocks were constructed? On the left-hand side is an example of a construction of if I mispronounced this, I'm sorry, please correct me, the Haithapu cirque. It's Viking from about the 9th to 10th century. And on the right-hand side is a 16th century Italian smock. And just by looking at these two pictures, if you look closely, you can see there is a rectangle body, and then they're called godets. They're the little triangle pieces that are sewn into the skirt. It's got sleeves, and like the shoulder attachment is about the same. The triangle pieces are about the same, just like the neckline, and we'll get more into that later, are different. So first, Viking smocks. Since linen is difficult to dye, linen undergarments were typically undyed. The Danish Viking women preferred plain undergarments, while Swedish Viking women, they preferred pleats. So just the difference between having it flat versus, say, having it pleated around the neckline. Neck holes were typically triangular or round. When they were round, they were typically either large enough to get just the head through the neck hole, or they could also have keyholes. And a keyhole would be if you have the neck hole just along the neck, but then have a little slit down the front, or it could also be off to the side, but typically just down the front. So it actually looks like the shape of a key, like that. The keyhole necklines that have been found, some of them have like little small brooches holding the neck closed. And on the right-hand side is a drawing of what a Viking smock was believed, how it was believed to be constructed. With 16th century smocks, they were also made out of linen, and they could also be called shifts or chemises, and they were also undyed. The whiter the better. Techniques like sun bleaching or the use of lye could be used to whiten the linen more. The smock could be embroidered with blackwork embroidery, and the neck holes were typically either square-shaped and low on the chest, or high-necked and then gathered into a high collar. This garment was worn under other clothing to protect the other fabrics from body oils and sweat. So here are the similarities between the Viking smock and a 16th century smock. Both were made similar to a T-tunic design. Both styles have a long rectangular body with a neck hole of some sort in the middle. Both styles have the godets, which are the large triangles, not to be confused with gores, which gores are actually, think of them as large trapezoids, whereas a godet is a triangle. And these large triangles could be on the front and the back of the rectangular body, so the rectangle is cut up from the bottom hem and then split open, and then that triangle put into that spot, as well as the godets being on the sides, and again, start from the bottom, and they extend up into the small point going up into the waist. Both styles have gussets, which are the little triangle pieces that I'll help show you in a minute, but they're little triangle pieces that are sewn into the armpit to allow for more ease of movement when moving your arms. Both smocks, both styles were made from linen. Both have sleeves that taper down towards the wrist, which means around the bicep there was more fabric and then it slowly got smaller and smaller and tapered down. So the dimensions around the wrist have less fabric than the dimensions around your bicep. And then both had some pleats or were gathered. Others were not pleated or gathered, but that applied to both the Viking and the 16th century smocks. Now, what are their differences? The necklines are different. The Vikings had their keyhole or their round neck holes, whereas the 16th century had square or gathered into a high collar. The Viking smocks were typically worn at ankle length, not floor length, and I'm guessing that's because of mud on the hems. I've learned that the hard way when going to Penzik, or say another camping event where I made a floor length smock and you get the morning dew and mud, or if you bend the wrong way, lean the wrong way, you trip over your skirts. It's a lot easier to have it just above the foot at ankle length. It's amazing how much less mud and dew and everything gets on your skirt when it's just above the foot. But the 16th century smocks were typically worn about knee length. They could go down to mid-calf, so somewhere between knee length and mid-calf. And I'm guessing that has to do with the hoop skirts that were worn during the 16th century, because this is also something where I have learned the hard way. I made a full length, down to the floor smock, then put a hoop skirt over it, and then tried to walk upstairs. You can use the hoop skirt to lift up your skirt and all the skirts on top of the hoop skirt, but it's very difficult to reach through the hoop skirt to pick up the smock, to pick it up so you don't trip over it as you're walking up the stairs. So it makes sense that they made them knee length or maybe down to halfway down the calf, but like I said, I'm guessing that's the difference, why they made it shorter. As most of the Viking examples are deteriorated remnants, it appears that the Viking undergarments did not have embroidered details, unlike the 16th century smocks, which could have blackwork embroidery over the entire sleeves and the top half of the smock. This is evident in the two pictures on this page here. On the left-hand side is a picture of one of the Viking fragments from the Hayathabu gravesite, whereas on the right-hand side, you can see the sleeves and the whole upper body of the smock are just covered in black silk embroidery. The 16th century smocks could also be trimmed with lace, while the edging on the Viking smocks were plain. So there are some of the differences. For creating your pattern, as a starting place, I would recommend using the smock pattern generator located at this website. And with it, you can select if you want a keyhole or a square neckline. And I will go through that with you momentarily and plug in my measurements and show you how to do this step by step. But first, let me explain how to create this. So when you go to the website and you place your measurements into the website, you click on it and it gives you a pattern. On the left-hand side is a pattern to give you an idea of what it will create for you, and it will show you how many inches long, how wide each of your pieces for your smock need to be. But before you cut your fabric, you want to review the measurements prior to cutting the fabric. For example, when I first did this, to give you an idea, here it is. When I first did this was back in December of 2003. And I've got little notes written on this, but on that printout, it said my sleeve length should be 20 inches. However, when I did the 20 inches, I wound up with a sleeve that ended about here. So I don't know if that was an error on my part with my measuring, or I washed it and the fabric shrank more, even though I had pre-washed the fabric. Maybe I put too much of my seam allowance. It could be any number of things, but I've learned that I prefer to measure out my fabric for my sleeves to be 23 inches, so that way they end up right at my wrist rather than partway up my arm. As the generator states, it may take 2 to 3 smocks to adjust the pattern to get it just right for your preference. Another example, on my pattern, the one from 2003, it showed that my gussets should be 6 by 6 inch triangles. However, I've learned that I prefer my gussets to only be 4 inches, so 4 by 4, rather than 6 by 6. Now, let's discuss fabrics. For historical accuracy, use linen. If you're creating a Viking smock, an undyed linen tabby would work well. If you're creating a 16th century smock, shift, chemise, whatever you want to call it, and this also might depend on your station and what your persona could afford, a fine linen made of a handkerchief weight would work best. Also, for the 16th century smock, adding some blackwork embroidery could help with the appearance of your smock, but please note that all edges along all of the fabrics of the linen, they would need to be turned under and stitched, or you risk the linen unraveling when you wear it, or definitely when you put it into the washing machine. And I'll show you examples of that too here in a few minutes. For an easier alternative, it's cheaper and it's easier. I suggest using muslin. It's not historically accurate like the linen, but you also don't have to worry about folding under all of your edges, and because I'm talking all of your seams need to get folded under on the linen. On the muslin, you don't have to worry about folding down all of your seams and tacking down all of the edges. In my opinion, the linen looks better, plus it's historically accurate. However, again, the muslin, it's cheaper, making it more affordable, and it works well depending on who you're making it for. I'm a mother of 4, so if I'm making this, like say for my daughter, it's great because I'm not having to spend that much money on something she's only going to fit into for maybe a year before she grows out of it. On to the instructions. The instructions here that I have are a little different than what you will find on the smock generator website, but this is my personal preference on how I like to sew it, and I'll go into that momentarily. But first, you want to take your arms, lay them down, and then take the gussets, and you will take one of the short sides of the triangle and attach it to the arm. As you can see on the bottom picture on the left, the 2 triangles are folded in and then they're sewn on, attached to the sleeve. And if you see, I've also got an asterisk on the left-hand side that says, sew hem of the sleeve at the wrist. This is my personal preference. I like to go ahead and sew the hem of the sleeve that's at the wrist. That way later when I sew up the side seam, I can just sew it up and I'm done. I don't have to worry about trying to fit in the size of the wrist into my sewing machine, because since I've got a small wrist and a small hand, that I have found if I sew up the side seam first and then later do the wrist seam, it's very difficult, almost impossible for me to fit that into my sewing machine and actually sew the hem. So this is where, if you're like me, you have small hands, a small wrist, you may want to sew the hem of the sleeve first around the wrist. Next, so you've got the large body of fabric, it's one long piece, one long rectangle. What you want to do is fold it in half, and you want to fold it in half widthwise. So at the fold would be where the fold is where your shoulders will be. And then cut out the neck hole if you've not done this already. And at least on my pattern, I want 2 inches of the, you're going to be cutting out square, but it's going to overlap that fold. So 2 of the inches will be on one side going down, and then 7 inches going down on the other side. And I can show you more later what I mean by that. Let's see. So once you've cut out your neck hole, you can either cut out another square, a square that's larger than your neck hole to fit that exact same neck hole, and that way you can line your neck hole. Cheaper, easier, well, I don't know about cheaper. I guess it depends if you're using linen or not, but an easier, not historically accurate option, but definitely easier, is if you buy bias tape and just line your neckline with the bias tape. And let me go back to that. Also, you want to sew first what you're lining it with. You want to sew on the outside first and around the neckline, and then flip it over, or sorry, flip it in, so that way the bias tape or what you're lining is now on the inside, and then you'll have to fold it under and then sew again on the inside, and this will help create a nice, neat seam around the neck so you don't have to worry about bunching or gathering in funny places. Next, what I like to do is I like to attach the godettes, the triangles on the sides, and the sleeves. So what I will do for this is I will lay out my rectangle body flat so it's very long, and then I put my triangles on the four edges right along the bottom hem. And then if you remember those where the folds were for your shoulders, you should still see the fold in the fabric, especially if it's linen. It tends to keep that memory in the fabric. So you'll see that little bump where the fold is, and that's exactly where I like to take my sleeve and fold the sleeve in half, and then that tells me where my middle part of the top sleeve will be, and I put that down on the fold, and then I sew it in. So that way the middle of the sleeve goes to the fold, which is right where the top part of the shoulder should be. So from here, you can see on the left-hand side, the shoulder seam where you sew in the sleeves. And then on the bottom, on the right-hand side, you want to pin in the godettes. And like this, I pin everything first, and then this way, I can just keep sewing in one continuous line, because depending on your body measurements, you might find right when your gusset ends, the godette begins, and so you can just do one whole continuous line down both sides. So here's another visual of what I'm talking about, with laying the fabric flat and then putting the godettes on the four bottom sides on the left and the right, and then the sleeves are there in the middle. You can see the dotted line right along the keyhole neckline. There's a dotted line on the top and the bottom. That's the fold of the fabric. In the middle of the sleeve should be right in the middle where that fold is. And this picture is a diagram of a Viking cirque, which can also be a smock, which was inspired by the evidence from Birka from about the 9th to the 10th century. So after you've sewn up your wrist seam, added on the gussets, attached your sleeves and with the gussets and the godettes all onto the side seam, you've done your neckline. Now you want to fold everything in half and sew up the side seam. So from here, what I like to do is I start at the wrist, and then I work my way down the arm, down the armpit, and then on down to the body, down to the hem. I like to start with the wrist first because you've already done that hem, and so you want that hem to be even. And that way, as you go continually down, you'll find, especially with linen, sometimes your fabrics don't always completely match up down at the very bottom hem, but you can hide this if they're like your fabric is slightly uneven, where like say one piece is slightly longer than another piece. When you go to roll up your hem as pictured on the right hand side, as you fold up your hem and stitch it in, if one piece is a little bit longer than another piece, it's all hidden in that bottom hem. So congratulations, after you've done all of this, you have made a smock. Yay! And here are some works cited if you want more information. Okay, right now, I'm taking my waist measurement. Now, you need to measure from your shoulder to your wrist. And typically, instead of to my wrist, a lot of times for a little extra seam allowance, I like to measure to the first joint, to my knuckle right here. So from shoulder to my first joint, so I'm holding it in place right here, like that, and that is 24 inches. Now to measure around the widest part of your hand, that would be right along here. So just hold that in place and then wrap it around. And you want to make sure you can remove it, put back on. And so for me, it's about, I'd say about 7 3/4 of an inch. I'm going to measure from shoulder to shoulder. So from here, just shoulder to shoulder like that. Which for me is 14 inches. Next, take your measuring tape and measure around the bust. Maybe. And when you're measuring the hips, you want to make sure you have the measuring tape around the largest part of your backside. Next, you'll want to measure around your bicep. And with this, you want to make sure you've made a muscle, because as you'll see, I can make it really tight here, but as I go like this, it actually spreads the measuring tape a bit, so you want to make a muscle. And for the final measurement, depending on if you are making an Elizabethan smock that you want to be at knee length, or if you want to make a Viking smock that goes ankle length, this measurement can vary. You want to measure from your shoulder down to where you want the hem to be. And so for this, I like to use an actual measuring stick for this. Just that way I can make it straight up and down by my feet. And then I move it up to where I want my hem to be. And then once I've got it where I want my hem to be, then that's where I stop and I know where to start measuring. So for example, right here, I've got the top of my measuring stick right here, and the bottom looks to be about maybe a few inches below my knee. And so this right here would be 40 inches. And from here, you can see I've got the smock pattern generator. And from here, again, it tells you it may take you 2 to 3 times making a smock to get it just right to form fit you, but you will put in your measurements. And so from here, I'm going to go ahead and put in my measurements. Like my shoulder to wrist, that came out as 24, the widest part of my hand. Let's see, it was 7 3/4, but I can make it 8. I'll modify it as if I need to later. Shoulder to shoulder, that's 14. Let's see, hip. And with this one, I'm only going to go down a little bit below my knee rather than down to my ankles, because I'm going to be doing a 16th century smock. So that's why I'm making it 40 inches. Right here it says your fabric width is optional. And since I'm doing a 16th century smock, I want the square neck holes, so that's the bottom on the left here. And now just click to generate your custom fitted smock or pattern. And here is a pattern. And at the top, it tells you that all pieces are generated for a 1/2 inch seam allowance, how many yards of fabric that you need. For 45-inch wide fabric, you would need 3 yards for this. And it shows you each square on this is 1 inch. So then you could go through and be able to count how many inches to your square neckline on either side of the square neckline to the shoulder. Here it says side gore, but it's really a godette. Remember, the gore is a trapezoid and a godette is a triangle. And then over here, the underarm gore, those would be the gussets. And you will cut them out as a square, but then cut it on the diagonal. So then you will have the two short sides. If you think of the Pythagorean theorem where you've got a squared plus b squared equals c squared, the side A could be sewn to the sleeve, side B will be sewn to the body, and then C, the hypotenuse, will be the part that gets sewn into the side seam going from the arm down the body. So again, here's the pattern here, and like I said, here's the sleeve, and right here, think of that as A, side A, here is side B of the gusset, and then side C, the hypotenuse goes right there. And there are more explanations for the measurements to help you with figuring out how to measure if you need to modify any of your pattern. Remember that pattern I said that I printed out back in 2003? Here's an example of it, and it shows where I've had to mark things and scratch them out and write little notes if I wanted it 15 inches wide or if I wanted it 16 inches wide, how long I wanted it. At 113 inches, I believe that's for an ankle length for me. And again, you can see where, like here it says 10 inches and I modified it to 9 inches. Here it says 20 and then I've modified it to 22 and scratched that out and put 23. Again, as the website states, it takes 2 to 3 times to figure out your custom fitted smock. And here is an example of a 16th century linen smock that I made. It goes below my knees, but as you can see, it's linen and I did not fold over my seams. So as you can see, like I said, it can and will start to unravel. And because it's linen, once I put this in the washing machine, it will unravel and unravel quickly. But also, what I did, if I flip this to the outside, you can see where I have trimmed it with black silk thread. So when I wear it, I look like I have a little bit of black work embroidery right on the edge of my neckline. Remember where I mentioned before about taking a piece of the same fabric that you used? So for this is linen, so I used another piece of linen and I lined the neck hole here. You can either cut out a large piece of linen and put it over top and then cut out the inside hole and then sew it along that, or the other option, like what I did, I just took one long strip of linen and I sewed it onto the front side first, right along here, and then folded it over and then folded it under right along here and then sewed it in, and then where the fold or where the seam is for the first seam, that's where I did this black work stitch right here to hide that seam. And right here is an idea. If you use, this is muslin and this is bias tape. And so as you can see, if I zoom in maybe right here, you can see this is the front side. And I sewed the bias tape right along here. And then I folded all of the bias tape onto the inside. And I sewed it right along here. And as you can see, I didn't even fold it over. This is the rough edge. But I don't have to worry about the bias tape unraveling, no matter how many times I throw it in the washing machine. And also, how I said this was a cheap alternative to the linen is because I couldn't tell you how many times this has gone through the washing machine. And if you look, this is one of the shoulder seams. And you can see it's slightly frayed a bit right along the edge here. But other than that, I don't have to worry about it unraveling the way it would if it were linen. And so this can handle many washes because, well, children seem to be magnets for dirt. And here is the outside of a smock that I made for my daughter. You can see here's the sleeve, here's the wrist. All of this is hand stitched. So I hand stitched that, and then I sewed up the arm. Here's what one of the gussets look like. Here's where like the armpit would be, and then here's the other gusset. And because it's a Viking smock, I've got a rounded neck hole. And what I did with this specific one is there is evidence that they may have had a drawstring in the neckline. So I made her smock to be a little big, and then I used linen thread with with beeswax on it. And this waxed linen thread I used as a drawstring, so that way once I put on her, I can pull the neckline tight like that, and it gives you that sort of gathered look. Remember before where I said if you do use linen, it's historically accurate, but you will have to fold over all of your seams. This is the underneath side of my daughter's cirque, and from here you can see here is the wrist, and here is the underarm seam, and with the seam I've had to fold over both sides, and I just tacked down the thread, or sorry, tacked down the fabric all the way down. Here's what the armpit looks like on the armpit, and then here's the shoulder seam. So all of this, here's one side seam of part of the godot. Here's the side seam going down the middle of, or the side of the body. Here's another side of the godot, and as you can see, there are a number of seams that all need to get turned over, folded over, so that way when you wash it, you do not have to worry about the linen unraveling in the washing machine. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, please submit them in the comments below. If you like the video, please select like and subscribe to be updated for future videos. Have a great day.